to start, Mark, by asking a question that comes from, and well, I don't know how early this essay is, but it's around 9/11. So it's called Can Poetry Console a Grieving Public? In it, you wrestle with the inadequacy of poetry, of art, to represent great tragedies. And I was struck by how Wordsworthian you sounded in it. And two questions arise for me from that. One, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your sense of how the poet connects to the reader, and whether you still feel the same way about representing a tragedy on the scale of the World Trade bombings.
How the poet connects to the reader is something that one has so little control over, you know. And it seems that part of the nature of this art is that the poet is incredibly fussy, obsessive, working to shape the text as if we could control the experience that the reader has of it. And so we do everything in our power to point the reader in a particular direction, to make suggestions, and then people take the poem and make of it what they will. And actually I love that about this art, that the poem is a kind of meeting ground between the interiority and intentions, notions of the writer, and the interiority of the reader. So I often find that people, when they talk to me about my work, may bring all kinds of experience to bear upon it, which I did not have in mind, but the poem, in some way that seems to me legitimate, invites the reader to do exactly that. So I appreciate that. And maybe particularly when we confront circumstances which elude language, how do we feel after the raw wounding of New York City on September 11th? How do we feel in the light of an epidemic, in the grip of a war, which you know, so many of our citizens find wasteful and reprehensible? What can serve us as a kind of catalyst for feeling? And it seems to me that poetry can do that some of the time, provide a kind of, in a way, a kind of public space in which the reader can enter and see something of their experience mirrored. So the second part of your question, you asked me if my feelings had changed. Well, I think it's been a few years since I wrote this essay, but I think one of the things that I emphasized in it was that the poem, which acknowledged its own limitations, seemed to me much more likely to be capable of being convincing, you know? And I can give you a couple of examples of that. There's a famous one from Pablo Neruda in one of the poems describing the Spanish Civil War, when he says that, in somebody's translation, the blood of children ran in the streets like the blood of children. That there simply is no commensurate metaphoric equivalent. And this is a way of acknowledging that language has its limits. Poetry cannot wrap itself around the incomprehensible without being irresponsible in the process in some way, unless it acknowledges that those limits exist. So in the essay I also talk about a beautiful Szymborska poem called Looking at a Photograph from September 11th, in which she is looking at, the speaker of the poem is looking at falling bodies coming from the towers, and says that the only thing she can do for them is not to finish the poem. It's a beautiful gesture. You know, it says to us that poetry cannot remedy the ills of the world, that the poet cannot responsibly make a polished aesthetic whole out of terrible situations. But if the poem acknowledges its wish to remedy, its wish to heal, and also pays attention to the limits of art and to the limits of language, then I think it really does resonate with our sense of powerlessness and simultaneously our need for the difficult to be spoken.
I believe you closed that essay with a really powerful image of people gathering in a square, and one group was beginning to sing one song, I think "Amazing Grace." Another one was doing "America the Beautiful," and they never really coordinated with each other, but each group in its own way was contributing to the whole and trying to come to grips with it. Is that image does that image speak to this notion that if no single poem can address the enormity of something like that, then perhaps collectively artists, art can take us closer to that sense, and when the reader kind of sees what works for them.
Sure. And one of the things that was lovely about that moment, which was in Union Square in Manhattan during the week after September 11th, there were these spontaneous gatherings, and people, there was no leadership, there were just lots and lots of people there who needed to do something, and singing was one of the things that happened, but there was no coordination, so a song would take off for a while and die out, and another would pick up. I think it's true that collectively our attempts to speak become something more like an appropriate response to the whole that the singular can't really be. Yeah. I'm thinking about the way that very shortly after 9/11 there were these calls for contributions to anthologies began to circulate, and I was just horrified by this idea that I could now produce a poem about this experience. I could barely make a sentence about it. How could I have this sort of distance in which poetry might be made, and how could that possibly happen without sort of, I don't know, in some inappropriate way, being self-aggrandizing or somehow cheapening the gravity of the experience for so many people. In other words, 3,000 people die and I make a poem. So this kind of collective attempt to sing felt like a response that I could embrace, and perhaps perhaps that's the answer to many poems by many people, which each of which makes some little gesture in the direction of giving shape to our situation.
And I think it's in that essay that you contrast that to the simulacrum of emotion, the crafted memorial, which panders to a sense of having completely understood the tragedy and the appropriate response to it.
Right. You hold that image of people singing in the park next to these sorts of public memorializing events where we're listening to a pop song and we're praising heroes.
Right.
And exactly what you're saying has taken place. There's been a kind of streamlining and agreed upon narrative and a kind of a focus of collective feeling, which inevitably feels false, feels sentimental.